here's my story. Back in the mid-1800s, the southwest of the United States was seen as vast and wild. It was scorching sands during the day, sometimes freezing cold at night, rocks jutting out from strange places. How to tame this wilderness? Well, the United States government had an idea, and it involved camels. Camels, yes, of course, because camels had been used very successfully in all of those eastern lands for hundreds, well, actually thousands of years. They could carry goods, they could carry people, they weren't picky about their diet. They could travel miles of days with very little water. Seemed perfect. And so in 1855, the United States government bought 72 camels and brought them to the Mojave Desert. And along with those camels came the camel handlers, men born of the dunes who could control those large beasts. And among them was a man named Omar. He was widely admired and revered among all of the other camel handlers because he seemed to have just a way with controlling these beasts. He could do it calmly, but with determination and skill. No one else could do it better. Also, into the wilds of the Mojave Desert came a young woman whose name was Rachel Stokes. Now, Rachel was the daughter of Colonel John Stokes. He'd been assigned by the U.S. government, by the Army, to come into the Mojave to oversee what they called the Camel Corps. And Rachel was 18, beautiful, and really, really annoyed. She was not happy about being in the middle of the desert. She had been looking forward to her 18th year in Boston. It was going to be an entire year of balls and parties and feasts and singing and dancing and friends, lots and lots and lots of friends. And now she was stuck here in the middle of nowhere with no one to associate with but her father, a rather stern man, and a whole bunch of soldiers who stomped through the sands in heavy boots and had no desire or inclination for any culture or refinement. Well, after a few weeks of sulking, Rachel finally decided that she might as well look for the good, and so she went out into the desert, and what she found there was intriguing. Exotic-looking trees, cactuses, butterflies, and then, of course, there were the camels. And so she found herself going into the camel enclosures many times with questions. And that's when she met Omar. He was the only one of the camel handlers who had the knowledge and the patience to deal with her questions. And she had a lot of questions. How big are the camels? How much weight can they carry? How long do they live? What do they like to eat? She had so many questions. And pretty much their conversations, at least at first, were question and answer sessions. He had the answers, she had the questions. But it will come as no surprise to you when I tell you that gradually their conversations took a little broader turn. They began to talk about the places they'd come from, the good memories they had there, their families, their friends, their hopes, their dreams. And after a while, they realized that they were falling in love. Sometimes they would just sit side by side in silence, and sometimes Omar would sing songs to Rachel. She didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. They were love songs. And so they decided that they wanted to be together forever. They wanted to get married. Rachel worried about how to broach that topic to her father, Colonel Stokes. And as it turned out, she was wise to be worried, but also she didn't have to introduce that news. He'd already heard from some of the soldiers, and he was furious. He summoned her into his office. He pounded on the desk, and he said, "No daughter of mine will marry a camel man. Low-born, infidel, immigrant. No, no, Rachel. You will marry someone who is worthy of your station, worthy of your name, worthy of your ancestry, and I forbid you to be around that camel man ever again." But as you know, love will find a way. And so from time to time, Rachel could slip away. They could spend an hour or two together. And there was a a nice, stable boy who was willing to carry messages back and forth. And then, well, almost as if specifically ordered by Colonel Stokes, into that world came Stephen Gregory, Lieutenant Stephen Gregory. He'd been sent by the Army to be second in command to Colonel Stokes, and he was really happy about that position. It was a promotion for him, and he was a very ambitious man. Even before he came to the Mojave, he began thinking about how he would advance his position, how he would ingratiate himself with Colonel Stokes. And when he arrived there at the Army camp, he met Rachel. Perfect. What could be better to advance his standing in the Army than to woo the Colonel's beautiful daughter? Didn't hurt that she was beautiful. And so he began to woo with enthusiasm and determination, and of course, with Colonel Stokes' encouragement. But Rachel, well, she saw that even though he was from a good family, he'd been educated at all of the best schools back east, he was handsome, he was charming, she saw that all that was merely a veneer, that underneath the charm, he had a mean streak. And she knew that if she were to marry him, that would never happen. But if she were to marry him, he would see her more as a prize and a possession than as a partner. And of course, the contrast between Lieutenant Gregory and Omar couldn't have been clearer. And she was more convinced than ever that she and Omar needed to be together. They finally realized that the only way that this would happen is if they were to flee, if they were to escape, to leave that Army encampment. They did know that when they were missed, that there would be implications, that they would be followed. I mean, Lieutenant Gregory was already paying attention to Rachel's every move. And Colonel Stokes, he would be furious. But they had to chance it, and so one night, they slipped away under cover of darkness. They took a camel and little else, some water as much as they could carry, a little bit of food, and then they were off into the desert. They traveled far and fast because they were certain that they would be followed, that there would be a pursuit. And sure enough, one morning they spotted on a distant dune, atop that dune, 3 soldiers, Lieutenant Gregory and a couple of other soldiers. And so they began to redouble their speed, looking for places to get water, for places for shelter. And then, of course, the desert unleashed its fury, its weapon, a sandstorm. The sand swirled around, and it got into their hair, their eyes, their mouths, their clothes. It howled like a caged beast. They desperately clung to each other to avoid being separated, and it continued for hours and hours and hours. Well, several days later, a gaunt and wild-eyed Lieutenant Gregory stumbled into the Army camp. He told stories of the sandstorm, of losing his mount and his companions, and he was alive, but just barely. A broken man, broken in body and in mind. He died 2 days later. And a day after that, a single camel wandered into the Army camp, still had a saddle, but no rider. And so what of Rachel and Omar? Well, most people think that they never made it out of the desert, that their bodies lie beneath the shifting and swirling sands of the Mojave Desert. That's what most people say. But some people say that a few weeks after that storm, that a young man and woman came into a small oasis town, very remote. They told of the storm, and they told of surviving the storm in a small cave. They'd been led to the cave by their camel, and they waited out the storm there. When the storm was over, they emerged from the cave. The camel was gone, but they had managed to find their way to this oasis. And they lived there for the rest of their lives, in love and in peace, and far away from the army or anything else that would have torn them apart. Now, which of those stories is true? I can't be certain. But what is certain is that sometimes travelers in the Mojave Desert Sometimes, especially if the wind picks up and there's a sandstorm brewing, they can hear songs. It sounds like someone is singing. The words are unintelligible, but they are clearly songs of love. And people also say that from time to time, they see in the desert a bright, small, fragile flower blooming in the most unlikely of places. It is a symbol of love and peace, and people call it the desert rose. Woo.